There's Rick Kennedy.
Hey, Mike, how you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
Good. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Rick
Nice to see
Kennedy. Nice seeing you, Rick.
All right, everybody, I guess we will go ahead and get started. It's 2:03, it's 3 after. We're going to go ahead and get started. So hello and good afternoon. My name is John Dodds, and I am the President and Chief Operating Officer of Kencor Elevator Systems, which is an American elevator group company. I'm also the chair of the NAEC Member Services Committee, and I want to welcome everyone to this third quarter town hall discussion in what has become a series of dialogues with various leaders within the vertical transportation industry. These conversations during our town hall series of events have focused on topics that have been identified by NAEC members as important and significant ones for their businesses. With input from the Member Services Committee, the topics for the town hall sessions have been assembled from various sources, and we've attempted to cover a wide array of subject matter focusing on the vertical transportation industry. Earlier in the 2023 calendar year, the Member Services Committee identified a potential topic broadly identified as an economic update, as many of us in the industry had concerns about a potential recession later into 2023. As businesses are having to tackle high interest rates, continued supply chain disruption, inflation, banking turmoil, etc. Today's topic is going to focus on leading economic indicators, and our speaker will delve into the key leading economic indicators that can identify trends and help us forecast as to what may be coming our way into the future. Our speaker will show us tools that you can use to interpret and utilize data to make informed decisions, not only on a leading indicator level, but also utilizing your own data that you can find within your individual businesses. As a reminder, Member Services Committee is always looking for feedback on this series of events. So if you have any feedback in general, or if you have ideas about topics for future town hall events, please reach out to Lori Wolking, and she can be reached at lori@naec.org. Before I introduce our speaker and get into our event, I would like to provide updates on important upcoming NAEC activities. The NAEC CET-CAT certification annual renewal period is now open until December 31st, 2023. If you're a certified technician, don't miss the chance to renew your certification. Visit the NAEC website to renew your annual certification. Prepare to join us for the Spring Educational Conference at the Sandestin Golf and Beach Resort in Miramar Beach, Florida on April 14th through 17th, 2024. Don't miss this opportunity to mix business with pleasure in a paradise-like setting. Registration for this event will open in January. Now, it's time to move forward with our town hall event. We've set this up to be an interactive event. This is designed to be a more traditional Zoom meeting environment as opposed to a formal webinar. So we're encouraging you to ask questions at any time during the webinar. If you have a question, please ask it through the chat box or click your reactions button at the bottom of the screen and raise your hand, and we will look for an opportunity to unmute you to ask your question. As we always do with these events, we will try to be mindful of everyone's time today and wrap up no later than 3:30 Eastern Standard Time. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Mike Stamm has been an executive coach and independent consultant to business leaders for over 15 years. He currently coaches over 20 CEOs and senior business leaders as an independent contractor for Vistage International. Vistage International is the largest membership organization in the world, providing members with the benefits of private advisory boards, coaching, networking, and a wealth of resources and subject matter experts on a variety of topics that can be used to better business. Vistage is the world's most trusted CEO coaching and peer advisory organization, and Vistage chairs are individuals who are hand-picked, elite group of accomplished leaders who help CEOs, business owners, and key executives reach their highest potential. Mike Stamm has reached a master chair status with Vistage, which means he is one of the elites in the organization. Prior to being a chair and executive coach for Vistage, Mike was a Vistage member. Mike successfully led 2 different companies as a CEO over a 15-year period, building and growing them for eventual transition into the next phase of those businesses. In 1995, a Vistage subject matter expert on leading economic indicators spoke to the Vistage group Mike at that time belonged to. As a result of that encounter, Mike engaged that organization to determine how he might benefit from using such insights. Since 1995, Mike has been tracking and interpreting various leading indicators and helping companies see what's coming and how they may address the opportunities that exist within those cyclical markets. Mike, it's great to see you again, and thanks for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, John. I'm going to share my screen here and bring up the PowerPoint presentation. Hang on a second. Very good. So, John, you did a great introduction. You took a lot of what I was going to say about my Vistage experience here, but let me just add to that a little bit. First of all, I'm happy to be here. John explained my Vistage role as a chair and formerly as a member. So I've been over 30 years with Vistage in some capacity. My relationship with Kencor and John specifically is that John and I have worked together in a Vistage relationship for 10 years. I know Rick Kennedy, I see in the audience, he's been there a long time in the past. He was a member of a group with another chair that I respect mightily. And I see Matt Hollinshead is in the group today too. So we have a couple of people that I'm familiar with from Kencor. In my experience with Vistage, my first meeting as a chair was the beginning of 2008. And as John mentioned, I had been using leading indicators. Actually, the Institute for Trend Research, ITR, it was the speaker group that came to my Vistage meeting back in 1995. Brian and Alan Bolio are brothers, twin brothers that run this organization. It's actually second generation business. And I took away a lot of information from that meeting. My understanding from John earlier is that you guys might have heard one of the Bolios speak at a conference in the past. Anyway, these guys are very well known, and when I learned from them all of this stuff, and then as John was saying, since 1995, I was tracking all this stuff. I've compared notes with them a lot. on different data stuff. I've actually introduced them to the consumer sentiment as a leading indicator. And we compared notes even last week. I was following up with them on some things that I was seeing and wondering about. So anyway, I'm not the expert. ITR does forecasting for, they're talking about depression in 2030, 2035. They're talking about long-term things. But I'm taking the insights and looking at specifically the businesses that I work with, and also, you know, at least strategically, how do you move forward in the next year or so? What's facing you and how you're going to respond? So for today, first of all, I got to also apologize a little bit. My wife and I were in France, and we got back last Monday, a week ago, and we brought home a souvenir. Both of us got COVID during the trip. So here we are. I'm on the tail end of it. I know where my mute button is, so if I have to pause and stuff for coughing, I apologize. For today, my goal is to help you understand what the macroeconomic indicators are saying right now as it relates to recession, inflation, where are we going? And then I want to switch gears toward the later on toward what are the external indicators that might be relevant to your industry specifically. I found some data there that I think might be relevant for you. And thirdly, how might you apply some of these concepts in your own business? You don't have to have an external indicator to see what's coming down the pipe or to see what the trend is changing on you. So we'll talk through all of those points. There are some key concepts that need to be understood here. First of all, the availability of data. I mean, I paid the Bolios back in 2000 or 1995, and I was running a safety products company, and I thought for sure that there'll be some data on the labor force or, you know, employment or something like that that would tie to selling safety products and first aid supplies, PPE equipment. But they went through the analysis and they came back with a plethora of information, and they showed me one external indicator that worked. And they taught me at the time that there's two types of data from the government. There's seasonally adjusted and there's non-seasonally adjusted data. Non-seasonally adjusted data, an example of that is when somebody gets laid off and they run down to the unemployment office and file a claim, there's an actual number that the government gets. Okay, and they report that number on Thursdays, every Thursday, every week. Seasonally adjusted data would be when they do their monthly employment numbers. Like we just had one last Friday. You ever notice that those numbers are absolutely round numbers, 315,000 or 386,000? There's not any decimals. There's no, you know, and 792. Those are seasonally adjusted numbers. They're not. They're making the numbers look right. Sometimes if there's a storm, they're adjusting for what they think should have happened. Some of the construction data that I'll show you later on is seasonally adjusted, unfortunately. But whenever there's available data, I look at non-seasonally adjusted because there's no monkeying around with the numbers. There's also various private sources that are available. As an example, one of my members is in the transportation business, and the American Truckers Association has data that they provide on truck tonnage being shipped from all the truckers that are part of their association. There's also in the construction industry, the Dodge Construction Network has a great amount of data. And I've learned about that from one of my members who wanted me to help them do some leading indicators, and it works great. So there's a lot of data out there, and some of it you might have to pay for, some of it you don't have to pay for it. Another key concept is the idea of the rate of change of the data, not necessarily the amounts, but the rate of change. Financially, we all have a love affair with year-to-date financial statements. And if you think about it, let's say it's 3 months into the year, first quarter. You're comparing 3 months against the budget, and you're comparing 3 months against the prior year. And then you might say 6 months or 7 months or 8 months. What you're doing is you're missing the rate of change. You're looking at comparative to prior year, but you're not looking at the rate or the velocity or of the change. The rate of change is like an early warning system. So let's take a look at the idea of rate of change here. If I took one number, like a month, divided by the same month last year, if it was exactly the same, it's zero rate of change. That's this horizontal line. If I have a data series, it might be a 3-month average, 12-month average, 1-month average. But if it's growing and it's accelerating year over year, that's this B phase right here. And B is great. Your growth is accelerating at an increasing rate. It's a good trend. Let me put on my laser pointer so you can follow along a little bit better. So here's B growing positively. It's go, go, go. And a company in this mode, you're feeding the beast. You're just letting this thing go and contributing to it. Now, when you start topping out a little bit and the rate of change is still positive year over year, but it's starting to slow down, that's like a little bit of an early warning sign. That's a watch out kind of moment. Here you might be, from a strategic standpoint, thinking about optimizing your expenses a little bit. If you were concerned about this as it approaches zero, you know, then you're going to be very careful about making any big investments, because if you're adding a lot of overhead or interest costs, or adding a lot of labor and overhead at a time when you're slowing down in your volume, not a good idea. The D phase, where you're below zero and it's getting worse, it's decelerating at a more rapid rate. This is terrible. This is depression. This is recession, technically. This is doom. This sucks. This is not good. You don't want to be down here. If you waited too long on optimizing your costs, down here you're cutting costs to survive, or you have to do something to gain market share. Then when you turn the corner, you're still negative. It just sucks less. You're starting to improve a little bit, but you're still negative year over year. That's the A. There's a little optimism there. And then the pattern repeats itself. So this is the idealized curve, for cycles. And, the Bolios and most economists, when they look at rate of change, are talking about these phases. That's a key concept to understand. I'm going to give you an example here with some data from your industry. This is an example of why the rate of change could be an early warning system. I'm looking at commercial construction spending. And this is unfortunately seasonally adjusted data, but the yellow line is the government's estimate of annual commercial spending, commercial construction spending. And so the yellow line would be like your P&L, your revenue number. It's going up, right? You look at this yellow line and you say, this is great. It's rising, it's growing. If you look at the rates of change, the orange line and the gray lines here, the orange line is a trailing 3-month moving average divided by those same 3 months in the prior year. When we go year over year like that, we're taking out most of the seasonality. And notice how when the 3-month crosses the 12-month here, and how steep that is, it's very positive, right here, it's around 10%, but it's dropping like a rock. And then when it crosses zero, it's going negative. You'll see the yellow line doesn't start to go down until a few months after this 3-month crosses the 12. Conversely, look at the bottom down here. This is, by the way, this is the Great Recession of 2008. You notice how this thing started very beginning of 2008, the end of 2007. The housing market, and the bubble burst in the housing market, you could see that happening much earlier than the recession. And then, of course, defaults and mortgages and all of that was the problem. Notice how the 3-month crosses the 12 down here, and then several months later, a few months later, the absolute number turned up. That's the early warning sign. You see a lot of choppiness through here where it's up and down, like like the elevators, right? Things are moving up, things are moving down. But you know, so you get a little choppiness in your numbers here on a different scale. The 3-month crosses the 12 downward pretty steeply, and you saw how the yellow followed. You see this turning up, you see this follow. So where are we at right now? This is an early warning sign. This 3-month crosses the 12, it's dropping. It's still positive year over year, but you don't see it yet happening in the yellow number. So this is an example. We'll talk more about this specific slide and others as it relates to your industry, but I want you to understand the idea of rate of change is it provides an early warning sign on where the trend is going. So with that, let's get into the macro level stuff before we get into this, my headline news, spoiler alert for you, what we're going to be seeing here is that the macro economy, there's a recession signal that has been 100% accurate when the 3-month yield is greater than the 10-year treasury yield for more than 12 consecutive weeks. 100% of the time there's been a recession, and that signal happened back in March. 12 weeks of consecutive inversion of the 3-month and the 12-month, and that's been in place. And so people nowadays started to pay attention to that inversion. Like back in 2008, nobody believed it, but the Bullios did, I did, others. I've been studying this for a long time, and so now you're hearing about the possible recession in the end of 2023 or 2024. The Bullios are saying 2024. I was thinking 2023 the end, but right now there's the headline news is that some of the recent results are showing some resilience, and so there could be a soft landing, or it could be that we don't actually go into recession and we buck the trend here for once. To me, the idea of recession is largely going to depend on whether the Federal Reserve keeps their interest rates too high for too long. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the inflation. We'll talk a little bit about that because that's what they're trying to do, is fight inflation. But a key point to make here is that recessions don't usually affect everyone equally or at the same time. The housing market for residential housing has been in a recession now for a while. There's no disputing that. The elevator industry, as I look at your data, or at least what I think would be relevant data, is not in a recession. And in fact, multi-unit residential is looking not so good right now. It dropped pretty significantly recently. And we'll look at that slide a little bit later. But I'm super surprised at how strong offices, lodging, and commercial in general has been. So we'll see those points later on. So if you have questions as we go, I'm probably going to cover those points when I get to those sections. But nevertheless, that's the headline. So the macroeconomy is measured by GDP. Technically, a definition of recession is 2 consecutive quarters where GDP declines. And I'm not showing consecutive quarters. I'm showing the rate of change in GDP. And you can see, because it's quarterly, the green line is 1 quarter. The purple line is 4 quarters. So it's 4 quarters is a year. So the rate of change is spiked up this last read, which is positive. It doesn't have to go below 0 on a rate of change year over year, but generally it does when we have recession. John and Matt are familiar with this slide. This is what I call the big picture slide. It's a little messy, but this illustrates what are the components of GDP. 69% of gross domestic product GDP is personal consumption expenditures. This is that purple line, okay? And the green line is the stock market, the S&P 500. The blue line is consumer sentiment. And the red line is industrial production. Industrial production is a big number, and it's a significant part of GDP. But at the end of the day, it's what we spend. What we make is the industrial production, and what we spend is the personal consumption expenditures. That's most of GDP is embodied in this chart. Sentiment is a leading indicator for the actions that follow. You can see when I had my here's 1999, before the bubble burst in the tech sector. This was falling. Consumer sentiment was dropping, industrial production was dropping, stock market was dropping. The rate of change was dropping before the dot-com bubble burst. Okay, but we blame it on the dot-com bubble. You see how sentiment turned up, industrial production, personal consumption expenditures, and the stock market followed. There's a definite pattern here. Here's 2008. In 2007, the leading indicator was sentiment. It was dropping like a rock. These are 12-month moving averages. Every dot covers a 24-month span. 12 months divided by the same 12 months a year prior. So you can see how sentiment leads, stock market, industrial production, and consumption expenditures follow. So where are we at right now? The sentiment number is rising very rapidly. It's positive rate of change on a 12-month basis. The stock market is positive year over year, in spite of the bumps and hiccups that we've been experiencing. Industrial production is not rising yet. Personal consumption expenditure is not rising yet. So when I was talking in the headlines about some resilience showing up here and some early indicators that we might be, not going to go into a recession, that's partially what I'm looking at right here. So let's look closer at consumer sentiment. This prior line, 12-month number here, this blue line, here's that number right here in this purple line. The 3-month moving average crosses the 12 and it rises up, and it's both in legitimate B. And I just was thinking about John Dodds. A lot of times when I'm talking with John, he's got his cap on and he puts it on backwards. And I think you could be called a legitimate B, John. That'd be a good rap name for you if you want to be like in Beastie Boys or something. But at any rate, we're definitely in a B phase, accelerating optimism, and that is going to help drive behavior, which will ultimately show up as it relates to the stock market, as it relates to other sectors. So now looking at the industrial production, excuse me, within industrial production, if you think about production, what are the leading indicators for production? There's sentiment, there's order activity for durable goods, that kind of stuff. So let's take a look at some of those indicators before we get into industrial production. The sentiment number for industrial production is the National Association of Purchasing Managers. Now they like to call themselves ISM, Institute for Supply Management. They do a monthly survey, and anything below 50 is not good. Anything above 50 is positive. I look at the rate of change in the number, and it's been negative, but it's starting to tick up a little bit. The rate of change is starting to pick up. So this is starting into a B or into an A. It's negative, but it's getting not as sucky as it was before. Sucky is a technical term. Durable good orders. These are orders for all durable goods, including aircraft and defense. Okay. And this is a big number dollar-wise, and it was in this C pattern right here where it was decelerating. It hit 0, bounced up a little bit. It's bouncing around a little bit. Now let's look at manufacturing orders without aircraft and defense, X aircraft and defense. This does not have that little bounce. It's still negative. The last several quarters, this thing has dropped from a 7.6% rate to a 4.9 to a 2.6 to a 0.62. I would really like to see this start to curl up, but it's not yet. Most my members aren't tied to the defense or the aircraft business, but I do have 2-3 members that are, and they are busier than hell. They're super busy. Military is, we're definitely gearing up for war, and you know, not just necessarily conventional war. I mean, space wars. Blue Origin is putting up a missile every day. Every day there's a missile going up. So that's showing up in this spending right here. But conventional manufacturing right now is still on a downward slide. It's not negative yet, but it's not very positive. So when you put all of those together, industrial production, the actual production hits zero. It's bounced up a little bit. It's like an ember. There's a little bit of a flicker there. My hope would be, you know, that we go back to seeing some improvement in the macro manufacturing environment, and then see this being lifted, not just because of defense and aerospace. So personal consumption expenditures is 69% of our GDP calculation. We're a service economy, whether we like that or not. And let me define that a little bit. Of personal consumption expenditures, 66% of personal consumption expenditures is for services, not goods. There's durable goods, there's non-durable goods, and there's services, and that makes the composite of the personal consumption expenditures. Elevator companies, like, you know, many of you are not manufacturing elevators, you're installing them, you're servicing them, you're repairing them, you're a service contractor. I'm a service contractor. Of course, financial institutions, their services. We're not manufacturing anything, we're providing a service. Distribution companies, distributors, their service. Transportation company, that service. So 66% of personal consumption expenditures is service, times 69% of the GDP. 69 times 66%, about 45% of the economy is service. All right, and so let's take a little look at that. Total personal consumption expenditures in the aggregate is somewhere around this 6% range. It's in this C. You look over time, you know, 5%, 6% is very sustainable over the years. So we're kind of at a normal level, which is not bad. We're spending normally. Durables is a smaller number than I originally would have thought. If I look at the absolute numbers, durables is a small fraction. This is cars, washing machines, etc. It's about a 4% rate of change. It's not terrible. Services is solid in that 8% range. That's pretty good. So, you know, I don't see a lot of concern right now about our spending. Retail sales is interesting. We think about retail sales. This includes Amazon. This includes brick and mortar. This includes grocery stores. This includes, you know, wherever you're shopping. The rate of change here was in this C pattern. Didn't get below zero. Hits zero. Popped up a little bit. I superimposed the absolute dollar amounts here, so you can see. Here's the pandemic. Everybody stops. Everybody starts spending again. Look at the elevation of that. So even though it's looking like it's near zero here, it's still growing. It's still a very robust number. So from an economic standpoint, these are the things that are going to keep us from recession. But if we spend too much, that's causing inflation. So that's the fine balance. So let's talk about inflation. The Federal Reserve's mandate initially was purely to fight inflation, and then later on the secondary mandate was to manage employment, help with the employment situation. I think there's an unofficial mandate, and that third mandate being manage the stock market, manage investors' activity, perceptions. So, I mean, it wasn't that long ago that Federal Reserve wouldn't publish their minutes. They wouldn't have press conferences. They wouldn't have all these speeches and conversations. Now they're doing all that. And so the market reacts to this. The implied inflation rate, when I looked at the GDP, I didn't explain this, but there's real GDP, which is inflation adjusted, and there's nominal GDP, which is the actual number. And I looked at the difference between real and nominal, and it's 3.6%. That's the GDP implied inflation. And then the traditional definition of inflation is from the consumer price index. And that right now is 3.67. So, you know, we're in that 3.6% inflation rate right now. The wage, when you think about what are the components of inflation, wages is the sticky one that the Federal Reserve is worried about. There's wages is part of inflation. Producer prices, the commodity prices of what we put into our products, goods and services, is part of the inflation factor. My headline here is that PPI is negative. It's deflationary right now. I did find PPI for the elevator industry, and I'm going to show you that, but it's actually a positive number, but I think this is going to resonate with you a little bit. So interest rates, wages, the money supply, all of these things contribute to inflation. And the Federal Reserve has cut the money supply. This is negative year over year money supply for the first time ever. And the Bullios mentioned that too. I was talking with them about that, and they said this is unheard of. So the money supply is less, the rate of change is negative. It's still a very large amount of money out there to be spent. Wages, though, is the problem. And the Federal Reserve says that they want to see inflation at 2%. Why the hell are they saying 2%? That is not normal. When the phrase "the new normal" came about during the Great Recession in 2008, when I think Mohammed El-Arian or somebody like that at PIMCO at the time was talking about low interest rates and free money because we have to stimulate. This is going to be the new normal. Well, we certainly got inflation post-pandemic, and we'll talk more about that. But wages, people were trying to get people to come to work for me, come back. I'll give you bonuses, I'll give you increases, I'll give you more wages. And we inflated the labor market, got inflated, very inflated. And I think anecdotally for service technicians, you guys, your starting pay probably is a lot higher now than it was, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, because the market is inflated. So when the Federal Reserve is talking about getting inflation down to 2%, and if you look at the components of inflation, the money supply rate of change is negative. What they're doing is they're going to fight inflation at the expense of the labor force. The only way to bring wages down is to fire people, lay them off, and replace them with somebody cheaper. That's terrible. So I think they're going to overshoot the mark here if they're trying to get to 2%. By the way, I talked about the old normal. It wasn't that long ago that, when I moved to Pennsylvania, I took over running a company here. And at that time, the 10-year treasury was like 4.5%. The good, the bad, and the ugly at this company got 3.5% wage increases every year, whether they were good, bad, or ugly. It was not out of range to give 4% raises. The CPI, Consumer Price Index, was somewhere around, 5% at times, 4%. Long-term averages, 2%, too low. Why not be satisfied with the old normal? We're getting back to where it should be, in my opinion. So let's take a look at producer prices in general. When the pandemic hit, we had supply chain issues. We were having trouble getting people back to work. We started having to give more money out. All the inputs, commodity prices, everything went up. And now it's dropped like a rock. It's negative. It went down. Right now it's -4. but it was down to -10. So within producer prices, I can look at industries and beautiful. PPI for, this is not my wording, this is PPI for elevator and moving stair manufacturers. So here's your data. The producer prices, skyrocketed. No shit, you probably all, experienced that. It's dropped down pretty fast, but it's stabilizing around this 4% range. This is probably because producer prices for the elevator industry includes labor. It includes the raw material, like the components and the assembly and all those things, hydraulics, whatever the parts are. But you've got some producer price inflationary pressure still in this market. Consumer prices is ultimately where we measure inflation, because this is the end product. Consumer prices includes producer prices, the labor, all the inputs, and what we spend for it with margin as well, profit margin. And so right now it's dropping. It's around that it's at that 3.6% number I quoted earlier. If the Federal Reserve would look at over time and see that this is a normal range and get off of their 2% target, I think we would be happier. We'll have a soft landing. But the Bullios, I actually reached out this past week and asked them what their take is on this, and they're huddling right now about the Federal Reserve continuing higher for a longer period of time. Their belief is that where we're at right now, if we just let things go, this will keep coming down to their target level, that they're going to overshoot it if they keep it going. So now I'm going to shift gears to housing market. John and Matt know from these quarterly things that I do that I talk about housing regularly on a quarterly basis. I'm looking in the macro level at single unit housing, and I'll show you all the pieces to that pieces, but it'll be a great segue into the elevator specifically. Residential construction, single units, building permits. I was talking earlier about the housing market being in a recession. It's been below zero for quite a while here. Building permits have started to rise, and you can see that we're in an A right now, the A pattern, where we're sucking less and we're starting to look possibly at some optimism. Starts to me is more important than permits. I can get a permit and sit on it. Once you start a project, you are committed. You're not going to start a project and stop unless there's something big happening. So housing starts is in a little more solid of an A pattern. It's rising. Its 3-month moving average has crossed the 0 line here, so that's good. The 12-month is starting to perk up. Like to see that continue. Single units sold. These are new homes sold. So these are Toll Brothers, Pulte, Hobdavian, developers, right? And you can see that the rate of change is rising year over year, in spite of mortgage rates, in spite of high interest rates. Here is existing home sales for the National Association of Realtors. And, that was deeper, darker, recession, partially because there's just no availability. The inventory of existing homes is pretty short. So, that's where I'm literally looking at, if I see some really solid builders out there, financially speaking, these guys are going to, if this continues and then we don't screw the pooch here with interest rates and mortgage rates, we could see a real positive boon here for the housing market. It'll come out of recession. So that segues into the elevator industry. In preparing for this, I was talking with John, and he turned me on to a couple of market studies. IBIS, Credit Suisse, which is now owned by UBS. Private equity companies do studies as well. And I read some of these, and first of all, I'll say the difference between what they're doing and what I'm talking about, they're looking at trends, but they're looking at future. They're projecting based on interest rates, based on other economic factors. I'm looking at various, the relationships of these data points and stuff like that. But my experience is that the amount of time it takes for them to do this analysis, like the stuff I was reading was already outdated, out of date, because this timestamp might have said 2022, beginning of 2022. The work was done in 2021, before interest rates were rising too high, before there was a recession concern. So there's there's too much of a lag there. In my opinion, though, the IBIS information that I saw, they referenced a lot of the data that I'm using that I'll be showing you earlier. So they at least grounded their market study in data that's readily available that we'll look at in a bit. So the other data sources would be construction spending, which we'll look at. Construction spending is a combination of new construction, renovations, modernization. It's not repair and maintenance stuff. It's, if you thought about your balance sheet and what you capitalize as an asset, it's got to be something that is new or significantly enhances the life of, or whatever, like a new roof would be capitalized as an asset as opposed to a repair. So the government data, we'll look at some of that in a few moments. As far as private data, I mentioned earlier about trade associations sometimes having good information. I was in the safety equipment distribution business. We sold safety products, first aid supplies. I was the head of CEDA, the Safety Equipment Distributors Association. We had a Dr. Al Bates, really cool guy, who did a lot of benchmarking for us, as an industry. And I asked him, well, could you also collect revenue, or could you collect some unit of activity or something like that that we could use to create our own leading indicator? And he did something along those lines. It was pretty good. I mentioned the Dodge Construction Network. One of my first members, or Vistage members, wanted me. At my first meeting I introduced in 2008, very beginning, I said, we're going into a recession. Be prepared. Tell me how you're going to run your business if you lost 20% of your business. So anyway, about half the group wanted to get into the economic indicators, and Bob in the construction, his company was a union shop in Center City, Philadelphia, that provided all the interior wall, gypsum, studs, all this stuff on sky rises and stuff. So Comcast Tower, building out that kind of stuff. The Dodge Construction Network would give you data on who's out for bid, who's doing stuff, and you could use the information to bid on it. And then they'd give you information about how many starts were there. And Bob's company would lag the starts by 8 months. You'd see, and that's about how much time it might take before you'd start seeing order quotes and flow and all of that from the general contractor. And so orders, quotes, orders, revenue, followed 8-month lag, beautiful data. AIA architects also might be another data. And some of these things like Dodge and AIA have MSA data, which means Metropolitan Statistical Area. So I can see here locally, I can see Camden, Wilmington, Delaware, and Philadelphia data in some of this stuff. I also want to mention that you have your own data. I mentioned quotes and orders, backlogs, revenue. If you didn't have any external data, you just looked at your rate of change on quotes and orders and bookings, you'll see your patterns. You'll see things starting to change. So let's get into a closer look at some of the government data. John and I were talking about this. Multi-unit housing is an area that condos, buildings have elevators, right? Right now, I'm in this little home. I downsized several years ago, 12 years ago already. Nice little home. It's tri-level. Maybe at some point when I can't handle the steps anymore, I'll move into a condo with an elevator in it. And so there's available data, and it's 5 units or more. Okay, so I grabbed that data. They don't have 20 units or more. It's 5 units plus, or it's single units, or it's side by side, townhouse kind of thing, or duplex. So I looked at the 5 units. I looked at apartments for rent that are built for rent, not for private residence. And I also looked at some aspects of construction spending: offices, lodging, commercial, and retail. So let's take a closer look at this. Here's the bad news. Multi-units, 5 units or more, the rate of change just this last week plummeted. The 3-month average is now down 19%, almost 20%. Last week, and I was sitting down and walking through this with John and Lori, and it was right around the 0 here. It was hanging there, and all of a sudden just plummeted. So, if your business is heavily invested in multi-unit condos or something like that, you might be seeing this trend right now. It's just going negative. Okay, so if you had your revenue overlaid on top of it, it's starting to flatten out. When it goes negative, now it's going to start to turn down. That's the early warning sign. Apartments, the data here is quarterly data, and it's not quite as reliable, but it's got a downward trend. Since it's quarterly, this is really a 4-quarter. The red line is 4 quarters divided by the same 4 quarters. So this is really a 1-year moving average. This slope right here is basically the same as this gray slope here. This is trending 12 months. This is trending quarter. Still above 0, but it's not going well. My son is 35 years old, married about 1.5 years ago, wants desperately to be in a house, couldn't find a house available that was affordable. Prices, everyone leaving New York, wanting to get out of the city and buy a home. So he's in a nice apartment building. He's part of this positive number here. He'll move out of there as soon as he can, though. So I wanted to share the multi-unit starts relative to the single unit starts. Key point here, and this is a source of optimism for those of you that might have a heavier input in the residential area. The trailing 12-month rate of change for single starts often leads the multi-unit. You can see how that trend changed up. Different scales here. There's 2 different scales, but this dropped, this dropped. This was all trending downward a little bit. Here it trended up, and it trended up here. Here is the bifurcation, as they say, technical term, where things didn't correlate so well, because this is when the pandemic was hitting. Everybody's buying houses or building houses because they wanted to get the hell out of the apartments and cities and stuff like that. But you see where we're at right now is you saw earlier how the 12-month number is starting to tick up for starts. I would hope that you'll see the same thing in a few months, start to happen. So if this is the same line here, for single unit starts that I showed you earlier, if this continues to improve, you'll see this start to improve later. So if you're tied pretty heavily into multi-unit housing, hang in there. Strategically, this is where you need to rethink your strategy a little bit. You might need to get down and dirty, steal market share, right? There's still going to be building going on. It's just, you might have to. Private equity doesn't want to hear this, but you probably need to get a little more aggressive on your margin. Make sure you keep the contribution toward your overhead while this recovers. Lodging construction spending. I've been driving to Wisconsin quite a bit for family issues and matters. And every stinking exit along I-80 has new hotels, every derivative possible of Marriott or Hilton or Hyatt or whatever. You know, they have all these little True and all these things everywhere. So if you look at the yellow line here, this is the absolute number of spend on lodging. And you can see pre-pandemic how high that was. And then it's dropped a lot. It's positive, the rate of change, you know, is growing. Right now, the rate of change is 20%, 3-month moving average on lodging over the prior year. But that's on a lower base, right? You know, you can see that this is lower than it was way up here. But it's trending in the upward direction. The fact that this is crossing a little bit is a minor warning sign. If it drops down, you know, in the next few months into the 0 range, then this is going to turn down, and now you're going to have the same issue as the multi-unit stuff we just looked at. Office spending is what really surprised me here. You know, you read the headlines, you look around, you see office space for rent. The vacancy rate for offices is high. Post-pandemic, you know, I mean, when everybody was working from home and now we're hybrid working, in spite of all of that and interest rates being as high as they are, the rate of change here is positive and growing. It's in B. Not super strong, but it's positive. Look at the absolute numbers. Positive, growing, increasing. That surprises me. So here's the caveat. My definition, not my definition, the construction definition of construction is not just new, it's modernization, refurbishing. You could be having a lot of money being spent on redesigning and refurbishing offices. That may or may not include an elevator. Also, the definition of an office is standalone office building. If in commercial spending, I'll define that a little bit. Commercial, as defined by the government data here, includes retail stores, warehouse distribution centers, manufacturing facilities, you know, anything from a commercial enterprise standpoint. When I was running the safety products business back in Wisconsin, Wisconsin, that's my Wisconsin accent for you. We built a new building, 100,000 square foot distribution center with an office attached to it, multiple floor office with an elevator. It wasn't Otis, it wasn't Schindler, I don't know what it was, but it was an elevator. That office is not part of office spend here because it's adjacent to a commercial building. It's adjacent to a distribution center or to a manufacturing facility, so that's not in the definition of office. So I included commercial spending as a macro number, possibly, because, you know, I'm not sure that you're doing elevators for freight docks or what have you, but if you have adjacent offices, you know, Uline is somebody I know pretty well, and they're in southern Wisconsin, and they've got huge distribution center and a huge office next to it, adjacent to it. They're part of this number, and you can see on an absolute basis how commercial construction spend has been skyrocketing. The rate of change is very positive, but it is declining. So this is an early warning sign. It's dropping fast enough that it's getting close to the below 0 line. So there's a couple of warning signs here as it relates to the construction market. Commercial construction, office is still robust looking to me. How do you play in that? I don't know. Lodging, housing, multi-unit. So these are the pieces that I'm inferring from my conversations with John a little bit that, you know, might be relevant for you. So at this point, I like to close off every time I do this for the Vistage groups. Ask them what are their signals, whether they have an external signal, an outside data source, or whether they have their own internal data, right? Like I say, if you don't have an external data that works, you still can track your pipeline, your quote activity, your order activity, your conversion, and see how that rolls. Just even your financials alone, if you just looked at 3-month and 12-month moving averages year over year and see these curves happening, you'll take action. You'll start, and you won't see that in the financials on a year-to-date basis or whatever until later. So that's the big message in terms of how might you apply this for yourself. So John, at this point, those are my prepared remarks, and I allocated, we get 90 minutes, and I projected maybe an hour of conversation. That's about where we're at. So at this point, if people have questions or comments or things that they'd like to discuss, I'm open.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll just ask the audience. Everybody's muted. You can certainly hit your reactions button, raise your hand. I'll unmute you if you have any specific questions while you're kind of going through that. Mike, just because of our relationship together, speaking about tracking internal data, you often tell the story of your former member who tracked quoting activity, tracked sales activity, and it correlated very closely until
Right.
it didn't. And then that
Yeah.
member engaged you to help him understand what's happening.
Yeah,
right?
thank you for reminding me of that. Yeah, because I say that almost every quarter meeting about Bob, the guy that, this construction company, the interior wall and all that. So he was correlating to the Dodge reports, 8-month lag. Everything is working great. 1 month in my one-on-one, he says, I want to show you my charts, something's wrong. And so he shows me the charts, and there's the Dodge reports upswing. There's the quotes upswing, and all of a sudden the orders weren't swinging, they weren't following, and nor was the revenue, of course. It's broken. So he says, what do you make of that? And I said, I don't know, Bob, what's changed? A change in person, change in policy, change in procedure, what's going on? And he had a new employee handling quotes. And he found out after following up that the dude was not following up on his quotes, open quotes. Well, duh. So there was a system issue. Somebody was not following up on quote activity, losing out.
So that's just an example of how you can track some of your own internal data, whether it be quoting activity, revenue, and by going through that trailing 12, trailing 3 arithmetic, if you will, that you can spot these things in your own business using some of your own data, maybe not necessarily tied to some of what we went through today. Rick, I don't know if you're still there. Mike, I was with Rick yesterday, and we were having a conversation, and you touched on it. You didn't put your normal slide up. I have the benefit of sometimes seeing some of your more detailed stuff. And Rick, we were talking about money supply and some of your thoughts on that, if you don't mind jumping in here.
Sure.
Yeah, Mike, great stuff as usual. Very interesting and well done. Money supply to consumer debt. That's really starting to worry me. The money supply, and you brought it up earlier, was at its lowest level in a long time, probably since 1930. But recently, in the past 6 months, consumer debt is escalating at a pace that is really alarming. And the overall, we're talking about a recession or thought of a recession or something even larger than that. And I think that's two of the independent variables that, really propel and can push this into, I mean, people just aren't saving. People just can't afford with the core prices maintaining, higher levels each month. What is your thought about the relationship between the money supply and consumer debt?
Well, there's two separate issues there. The money supply, the definition of money supply that everybody looks at is called M2, and that's the availability to pay something within a day or two. It includes your money market accounts, your Fidelity account, money market, anything you could liquidate to pay something. The definition used to be M3 and then MZM, zero maturity, and then M2. They've changed the definition of that. That being said, the money supply is the availability of the money, and the thing that that monetary theory folks miss is it's not just the money supply, it's the velocity of that money. The combination of the supply of money and the velocity, or how many times the money turns, is what's really important. So some time ago, John, you might remember me doing this. I looked at the money supply relative to the velocity, and I predicted the inflation factor based on that would be around 8%. And that was some time ago. And because the money supply was huge, and growing, and 60% more than it was in the prior year. So when we talk about money supply, the rate of change in the money supply is negative for the first time in a long time. We've been hovering over time, increasing the money supply by 6%, but we don't have 6% inflation, Rick, because the velocity is continually slowing down. When I studied economics in college, it was the velocity of money was like 3 times, and it's like 0.94 during the pandemic. For every dollar that's out there, it only turns 0.94 times, less than 1 turn. So the velocity of money times the availability of money is what really needs to be a factor. So that's my take on the money supply. There's still a lot of money out there. I'm sitting on a lot of cash right now. I mean, I'm 60% of my money is cash, waiting for the time to buy in. Now, consumer debt is a different issue. I have a golf buddy who's a senior economist at the Federal Reserve in Philadelphia. He's been there for a long time, and he can't say much, but I pick at him a lot, because I said you're trying to kill inflation at the hands of the labor force. And he says, Mike, the consumer is resilient and strong. So he pointed me to some data that's available every quarter, and it's like a balance sheet for consumers. The net number is very, very positive. The consumer is very strong, but that's the haves versus the have-nots. The people that have high consumer debt don't have and have mortgages and have all these other things. They're leveraged to the hilt, aren't healthy. The ones that so the outstanding consumer debt is super high, and as interest rates rise, they're in trouble. This is essentially what got the housing market into trouble. Your loan to value, back in 2008, people were getting more money than the value of their home because there was the income that things were going to rise. The bubble bursts. Private equity companies that leverage pretty heavily and make their investments have a high cost of capital right now, because if they're leveraged, their interest rates are high. They're scraping right now. The banks that are having trouble don't have enough spread between what they have to pay to the depositors versus what they're getting from the demand, because nobody wants to borrow at high interest rates right now. So the money supply relates to our willingness to spend, and then the interest rate and the concern with consumer debt is really not. On average, the duck is dead. I say if you aim 10 yards in front of a duck and 10 yards behind a duck, on average, the duck is dead. On average, the consumer is strong. But the reality is the ones that have consumer credit, high amounts of consumer credit, and rolling their credit cards over, student loan money, all these other things, these people are in trouble. And if interest rates stay high, they're going to be underwater.
All right, thanks. Second question I had for you. Have you ever utilized the Fred website, Federal
Yes.
Reserve?
Fred, the St. Louis Federal Reserve is the highest, best source of data. They aggregate from all different sources. So Fred, I have a data list. I have all these studies. I have used Fred for a long time.
Yeah, I find it pretty interesting. Yeah.
Who is speaking? Is that you, Rick?
Pardon me? Yeah, that was me. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, you're blacked out, so I couldn't see you. But Fred is my friend. It's the Bulios charged me a fair amount, and then I found out what they were using and where they got it. And it's like, shit, this is fairly easy. This is when I started doing it myself and comparing notes and stuff like that. But yeah, Fred is it's free. Federal Reserve data stuff I can download. Some of the data I can download back to the 1913. I mean, there's consumer price index back to way back then. So yeah, there's a ton of information. You just have to be careful if you're doing this on your own, what's seasonally adjusted, what's not seasonally adjusted.
Right, exactly.
That kind of stuff.
But they do have stuff that's specific. Just if you type in elevators, you'd be surprised what jumps up there. I mean,
Right. That's how I found your PPI.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And for those that are listening, Fred is the Federal Reserve of St. Louis. It's the Federal Reserve system dedicated or assigned the Federal Reserve in St. Louis to collect data nationwide.
Yep.
And compile it. And they've been doing that since what, I don't know, 1940, 1941.
Yes. I got an email this morning from Fred, highlighting that they're tracking 19 European countries in terms of some of their data sets. Just pointing out that so the Bulios use Fred information because it's conveniently aggregated. They aggregate a lot of private stuff too. University of Michigan consumer sentiment used to be on Fred, now it's not. But that's data that when I moved to Pennsylvania and I was taking over a company that was more consumer oriented, car restoration. If you think back to when you were 16, what was the car you were dating in? You want to restore that car. We sold you the supplies and the tools to do that yourself. And I was thinking, what's an indicator for that business? And I kept hearing about consumer confidence, the conference board, consumer confidence. So I spent like $2,600 to the conference board to get their data, and it didn't work. And then I realized what they were doing is they were taking University of Michigan's consumer sentiment number and then doing a bunch of other things to it to make it their own. So I got University of Michigan's consumer sentiment numbers for free, and it worked. Great. 3-month lead time, And I presented that to the board when I was, brand new, and I said, this is, you asked me to do what I did at the safety products business. This is one of the things I learned. By the way, that the whole economic indicator thing, this one Vistage presentation, more than paid for all my dues. I spent over a couple $100,000 of dues over the years. Just, I bought a company when it was in A. I sold a company when it was in C. It's perfect information if you know how to use it.
Sure.
Thanks,
Other
Rick.
questions?
If anybody has any question, let me know. Otherwise, Mike, we only have a couple minutes left. I know you're not an economist, you're not a financial advisor, all these things. But big picture summary observation, for the folks who are still with us for the last few minutes. You mentioned that, again, not all recessions hit all industries the same. You mentioned one other industry that's got a little bit of a lagging indicator. I think the elevator industry is also like that. We're going to see, 6, 8, 12 months lag after anything happens in the general economy. But what are your thoughts on, soft landing end of 23, 24, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, in March, I did a video that you've seen on specifically on recession based on the fact that there's signals and looking at all the other recessions. One of the key points that I made about recession is that if the definition is 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP, that's one of the reasons why it takes a long time. Like the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, are the ones that proclaim that we're in a recession, and they're always late to the party. And then when we're out of the recession, they're always late to the party to say we're done. But the reason why they're late to the party is because they need to see 2 consecutive quarters of decline. We're right now still doing second quarter. There's 3 reads of each quarter. And so the timing, if we're going to have a recession, my message all along was that it would take, if it's going to take a few months of a couple of quarters in a row of negative decline, we haven't had one quarter that has declined from one quarter to the next. So by definition, if there's going to be a recession, it's going to be later. Meanwhile, if the Federal Reserve is following this arbitrary 2% number as their target for inflation, which is too low, and if they hold the interest rates too high, I believe that they'll push us into recession. Even to Rick's point, high interest rates, cost of borrowing right now is pretty high, higher than we're used to, higher than people that have leveraged up big time, companies that are doing that. In China, for instance, Evergrande and another one, big realty oriented land development and stuff like that, they're defaulting on their bonds, and those bonds are held by us. Some of the U.S. Folks have bought those bonds or lent the money, and they're not going to pay. So this is going to be bigger when those Chinese development companies default on their bonds. That's going to hit harder than some of those SVBs or some of these little banks, right? So I think that I've said this before, and you've heard this, John. Recession signal is there, and when it does happen, we'll find somebody to blame for it. Every time there's been a recession, we've said, "Oh, it was the .com bubble." No, that was the result. The stuff was happening before the .com bubble burst. So I think we'll blame the Federal Reserve for keeping interest rates too high too long. The recession signal was there, partially because of them making the inverted yield curve. They purposely raised the low end of the yield. Now, I did say in my recession video that one of the problems with this recession is also the real yield on the 10-year treasury. There's no real yield. When we had a 10-year treasury that was 2% and inflation is more than 2%, you think about pensions, think about people that are tied to an annuity contract or something like that. They're priced on a 10-year treasury or something like that. They're losing money. Their inflation is high. So the real mandate is to bring for the Federal Reserve to provide a real yield, for the 10-year treasury to be higher yield than the inflation number. Right now, everybody's nervous about a 4.7% 10-year treasury yield. That's normal. but we're all screaming about it. You know, the market's reacting because it's not free money anymore. By the way, the stock market is priced off of treasuries. If you value a company, like I'm not sure how many of you had a company appraisal done before. You know, I can't see anybody, so I'll just assume that some of you have. There's three ways of valuing a company. There's comparable sales, there's comparable to publicly traded companies with some derivatives, but discounted cash flow, you look at your earnings and stuff like that. If I have a 10-year treasury that's giving me a 4.7 yield and I'm trying to price out a company, I'm adding 6 points for the equity risk. I'm adding another point or two for the liquidity or lack of liquidity. There's like 3 or 4 factors. Your industry might be more volatile. There's another factor for that. You add these factors up, that's called a build-up approach. And so, you know, it's not uncommon for a smaller business to have like a 15 to 18% cost of capital for equity. And so when you future value a company, like if I'm looking at a company I'm going to invest in, I'm looking at their forward earnings, I'm looking at their future cash flow, I'm discounting it at that cost of capital, 15%. And if that's going to give me the present value, that's how the stock market values the S&P 500. Forward earnings, discounted. So as treasury rates rise, the cost of capital rises. And as the cost of capital rises, if you want to figure out what a PE ratio should be, let's say I need a 15% cost of capital. 1 divided by 15, 1 divided by 0.15 is a 6.6 multiple. That's the yield that you need. A 15% yield is the inverse of that is your PE ratio. I don't want to get too technical on this, but all you got to do is look at Hershey's stock, HSY. They're consistently a 30 multiple. Why? 1 divided by 30 is a 3.33 yield. They're safer than the government. They produce consistently a return on your investment of 3.33. The risk factor is very low. That's why you pay a 30 multiple for that company. Whereas a company that doesn't have that great yield, you know, a 15% yield required because your business is dangerous and sucky and small and not profitable and all of those things, you'd rather, so a rising treasury rates is going to affects the market. That's why when the yields were rising, that's why the market was dropping, because people are pricing in, the analysts are pricing in what that means. You know, what's the spread going to be? You know, that's why money moved into the you know, that's why I did this March recording that I'm referring to. I did this the weekend of the bank failure. And I was talking about yields, and I was talking about my daughter who had a shitload of cash sitting around, moving money out of the bank in order to put it into a Vanguard account, where she's going to get, at that time, 4.5. Now it's 5.5. Money flows.
Okay, Mike.
Money flows the yield.
We've got just about out of time, and I don't see any questions. So, you know, as always, we want to make sure we end on time, or a few minutes early is not you know, terrible either. So, out of respect for everybody's time, you know, I'm going to go ahead and just call the end of this town hall event. Definitely appreciate everyone that joined us today. You know, reminder that this will be posted, you know, live for folks to view later on NAEC's website. Especially, Mike, appreciate your time, you know, for putting this together, for joining us today, for sharing your expertise with our group. You know, this may be new for many folks who are going to see this for the first time.
Sure.
And again, thanks to everybody who attended, and I will see everybody soon, hopefully, and look for an update on our quarterly fourth quarter town hall event shortly. So
Sure.
thank you.
If any of you have questions or things that come up after the fact, then my contact information, mike.stam@mastam.com, spelled STAM as in Mary, N as in Nancy, sort of like swearing. But you know, any questions, comments, thoughts that you want to share, I'm happy to follow up with you. Right? Thank
All
you.
right, thank you.
Hopefully I was of value to anybody, you know,